He held up his hands, counting on his fingers. You profited from agricultural reforms. You profited from healthcare privatisation. You profited from planning changes. You profited from financial regulation. And then, after leaving office, you profited from lobbying the government you had just led on behalf of a company that your regulatory changes had enabled. Sunak's voice dropped back to its normal calm tone, but the words were no less damning. You didn't just personally profit, Lord Cameron. You built an entire post-political career on monetising the policies you implemented while in office, policies that, not coincidentally, also enriched your family's business empire. The chamber was absolutely silent now. Even Cameron's usual supporters seemed unable to defend the pattern that had been revealed. But there's one more thing, Sunak said, pulling out a final folder, that explains why you fought so hard to implement austerity, why you were so passionate about cutting public services and reducing government spending. He opened the folder to reveal financial projections. These are internal documents from Astor Holdings Limited, created in 2010, just as your government was beginning its austerity program, their strategic plans for the family business, outlining opportunities that would arise from reduced government provision of services. Sunak began reading. As public sector healthcare faces budget constraints, demand for private healthcare services will increase substantially. Recommend increasing investment in private hospital capacity. That's from 2010, Lord Cameron, before your Health and Social Care Act created those exact conditions. He turned a page. Reduced local authority budgets will create opportunities in social care privatisation. Recommend establishing partnerships to acquire failing public services. Again, 2010, before your government's local authority cuts created exactly those opportunities. Another page. Austerity-driven asset sales will provide acquisition opportunities for agricultural and development land at below-market prices. Recommend preparing capital for strategic purchases, written before your government sold off public land that Astor companies subsequently purchased. Sunak looked up from the documents. Your austerity program wasn't just about fiscal responsibility, Lord Cameron. It was about creating business opportunities for your family's companies. You dismantled public services knowing that private providers, including companies you had ownership stakes in, would fill the gaps. You sold public assets knowing your family's businesses would be positioned to buy them. He closed the folder. You marketed it as necessary economic discipline, but it was actually the largest transfer of public wealth to private interests in modern British history, and you personally benefited from every aspect of it. The House of Lords chamber felt like it was witnessing not just a political confrontation, but the unravelling of a decade's worth of carefully constructed mythology. David Cameron remained seated, his earlier composure completely shattered, while Rishi Sunak stood holding documents that threatened to redefine everything the British public thought they knew about the Cameron era. Lord Cameron, Sunak said, his voice carrying a note of finality, everything I've revealed so far, the policy conflicts, the business connections, the personal enrichment, all of it could be dismissed as the actions of one compromised individual. Serious, certainly, but contained. He paused, and his expression darkened. But it wasn't contained. It was systemic, and it involved far more people than just you and your family. Cameron looked up, fear evident in his eyes. I want to show this chamber something, Sunak said, pulling out a large chart. This is a network analysis created by a team of forensic accountants I commissioned 6 months ago. It maps the financial connections between your government's policy decisions, your family's business interests, and the Conservative Party's major donors. He held up the chart, which showed a complex web of lines connecting names, companies, and policy areas. What this shows, Sunak explained, is that your family's business empire was part of a much larger network of Conservative donors who consistently benefited from your government's policies, and not by accident. He pointed to specific clusters on the chart. Here we see healthcare policy. Your government's reforms benefited private healthcare companies. Those companies were owned by or connected to at least 15 major Conservative Party donors. Those donors gave a combined £47 million to the party during your tenure, and several of them, including your father-in-law, were in regular private communication with you about healthcare policy. Sunak moved his finger to another cluster. Here's financial regulation. Your government's approach to financial services regulation, light touch, business-friendly, benefited the banking and investment sector. At least 20 major Conservative donors from that sector gave over £60 million to the party, and several of them, again including companies connected to your family, had direct access to Treasury officials and Number 10. He looked directly at Cameron. This wasn't just about you enriching your family, Lord Cameron. It was about a systematic arrangement where party donors received policy benefits in exchange for their financial support, and you were at the centre of it, coordinating between government policy and donor interests. A Conservative peer stood, his face red with anger. Prime Minister, you're accusing the entire Conservative Party of corruption. No, Sunak replied firmly. I'm accusing a specific network within the party, a network built around Lord Cameron's government, of creating a system where policy was traded for donations, where access was sold to the highest bidder, where the national interest was subordinated to the financial interests of a wealthy elite. He pulled out another document. This is a leaked internal memo from Conservative Party headquarters, written in 2014 by Lord Feldman, who was party chairman at the time. It's marked confidential, PM eyes only. Sunak began to read. David, the healthcare reform backlash is creating donor concerns. Suggest private dinner with major medical sector contributors to reassure them that implementation will proceed despite public opposition. Also recommend accelerating care home privatisation timeline. 3 major donors have specifically requested this. The implications were staggering. Party officials were explicitly coordinating policy implementation with donor preferences. Here's another, Sunak said, pulling out a second memo. From 2013, regarding agricultural policy, PM, Astor and related families are concerned about environmental regulations. They represent over £8 million in party donations. Strong recommend fast-tracking DEFRA reforms to address their concerns. He looked up. Your own party officials were tracking donor contributions and explicitly linking them to policy preferences. They were, in effect, running a system where significant donations bought policy influence, and you, Lord Cameron, were the primary mechanism through which that influence was exercised. Cameron finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Every party relies on donors. Every government faces pressure from various interests. That's just politics. Just politics, Sunak interrupted, his voice sharp. Is it just politics when your government cut disability benefits while giving tax breaks to your donors? Is it just politics when you privatised healthcare services that went to companies owned by party contributors? Is it just politics when you sold public assets to the same people who funded your election campaigns? He walked toward Cameron, holding a final document. This is a confidential report prepared by the Conservative Party's own Ethics Committee in 2016, after you left office. It was never made public. It concluded that your government had operated in a way that created the appearance of, and possibly the reality of, policies being influenced by donor contributions rather than public interest. Sunak held up the document. Your own party's ethics review concluded that you had compromised the integrity of British governance, but they buried the report because releasing it would have destroyed the party's reputation. They protected you, Lord Cameron. They protected your legacy at the cost of the truth. He turned to address the full chamber, and that brings us to today, to why I've chosen to reveal all of this now, in this public forum, despite knowing the political cost to my own party. Sunak's voice grew passionate. Because Lord Cameron came into this chamber and questioned my integrity. He suggested that my family's wealth compromises my judgment. He implied that I'm making policy decisions to benefit myself and my class, and I realized that I could not let those accusations stand without exposing the truth about his own record. He walked back to the dispatch box. My wife's family built a legitimate business. We pay our taxes in full. We've disclosed every financial interest. We've followed every rule. And yes, we're wealthy. I've never denied that or apologized for it. But what I will not accept," his voice rose, "is being lectured about economic integrity by a man who spent 6 years using government policy to enrich his family, who built a network of corruption disguised as austerity, who dismantled public services while personally profiting from their privatisation, and who then had the audacity to return to public life as if none of it had happened." The chamber erupted in noise, some applauding, others shouting objections, chaos breaking out across the red benches. Sunak waited for quiet, then spoke his final words directly to Cameron. "You asked me earlier what happens now. Here's my answer. I'm establishing a full parliamentary inquiry into conflicts of interest in government, starting with your administration. I'm referring your undisclosed company directorships to the appropriate authorities for investigation. I'm releasing all the documents I've presented today to the public so that history can judge the truth of your legacy rather than the mythology you've constructed." He paused. "And I'm proposing new legislation that will prevent any future Prime Minister from having the business connections you maintained, from benefiting from policies they implement, from building the kind of corruption network you created." Cameron sat motionless, destroyed not just politically, but personally. The reputation he'd carefully rebuilt over 5 years lay in ruins around him. "The big society you spoke about," Sunak concluded, "was always a fiction, wasn't it, Lord Cameron? It was never about empowering communities or building social capital. It was about dismantling public services so that you and your friends could profit from the pieces." He gathered his documents. "This chamber has witnessed the exposure of one of the greatest deceptions in modern British politics. A Prime Minister who claimed to be making difficult but necessary choices was actually building a fortune for his family and his donors. The British people deserve better. They deserve leaders whose integrity is real, not performed, and they deserve to know the truth about the decade of austerity that reshaped their country." Sunak turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Cameron one final time. "You're right about one thing, though, Lord Cameron. Wealth does raise questions about integrity, but not because wealthy people can't serve the public interest, because when leaders hide their wealth, obscure their business connections, and craft policies that secretly enrich them while claiming to serve the nation, that's when wealth becomes corruption. And that," Sunak said quietly, "is the difference between us." With those words, he walked out of the chamber, leaving behind a legacy rewritten and a former Prime Minister whose carefully constructed reputation had been dismantled with nothing but evidence and testimony. The House of Lords sat in stunned silence. David Cameron remained in his seat, surrounded by the wreckage of his political mythology. Several Conservative peers approached him, but he waved them away, his expression one of complete defeat. A Labour peer rose. "My Lords, in light of what we've just heard, I move that Lord Cameron's appointment as Foreign Secretary be immediately reviewed and that a select committee be formed to investigate the allegations presented today." The motion passed with overwhelming support, including votes from several Conservative peers who could no longer defend the indefensible. As the chamber emptied, Cameron finally stood, moving slowly like a man who had aged a decade in a single afternoon. His phone was already buzzing with messages from journalists, former colleagues, and political allies scrambling to distance themselves from the revelations. Outside the chamber, Rishi Sunak stood before a bank of cameras and microphones, the media having rushed to capture his statement following the extraordinary confrontation. "Today," he began, his voice steady, "I revealed uncomfortable truths about a former Prime Minister's financial conflicts of interest. I didn't do this lightly. Lord Cameron served this country for 6 years, made difficult decisions, and deserves respect for his service." He paused. "But respect cannot mean silence in the face of corruption. It cannot mean allowing mythology to replace history, and it cannot mean protecting powerful people from accountability simply because revealing their misdeeds is politically inconvenient." The British people have spent a decade living with the consequences of austerity, reduced services, closed libraries, struggling hospitals, families pushed into poverty. They were told these sacrifices were necessary, that there was no alternative, that difficult choices had to be made for the national good. His voice grew firmer. But today we learned that while ordinary Britons were sacrificing, those who demanded those sacrifices were enriching themselves. We learned that austerity wasn't just about economics, it was about creating opportunities for private profit. We learned that the people who claimed to be saving the nation were actually building their family fortunes. That's not just a betrayal of trust, Sunak concluded. It's a corruption of democracy itself, and it ends today. 3 months later, the parliamentary inquiry had confirmed most of Sunak's allegations. David Cameron had resigned his peerage and withdrawn from public life entirely, his reputation irreparably damaged. Several Conservative donors faced investigation for their roles in the Policy for Donations network, and Parliament passed the Government Integrity Act, establishing strict regulations on ministerial business connections and post office employment. George Osborne, who had provided the crucial testimony against Cameron, published a memoir titled The Price of Silence, in which he detailed his years of complicity and his ultimate decision to tell the truth. It became a bestseller, though critics noted the irony of him profiting from confessing to enabling the very corruption he described. And Rishi Sunak, having exposed one of British politics' most carefully guarded secrets, found his own integrity strengthened by the confrontation. He had proven that wealth itself wasn't the issue. Concealment, conflict, and corruption were. That holding power required not just competence, but genuine commitment to the public interest over personal gain. The Conservative Party would spend years rebuilding trust, but they did so with new standards, new transparency, and a new understanding that privilege came with responsibility, not permission to profit. David Cameron's legacy, once burnished by a carefully managed departure and selective memory, was now permanently defined by the truth. A Prime Minister who had used austerity to enrich his family while millions suffered, who had built a corruption network disguised as economic necessity, who had betrayed the public trust for private gain. History would remember not the mythology he tried to create, but the evidence that Rishi Sunak had methodically presented on that November afternoon in the House of Lords. The truth, as it turned out, was more powerful than any reputation, and more enduring than any carefully constructed lie.